Welcome to GPOguy.com, video training session number 100.4, Introduction to GPMC Part 3. In this session, I'm going to go through some of the backup, restore, copy, and import capabilities within the Group Policy Management Console. I'm also going to look at the basic reporting capabilities that come with the console. So let's start off by just going through the backup functionality. Group Policy Management Console is a great tool for performing and managing your backups of group policy objects. And I tell people that with Group Policy Management Console, there's really no reason to not do regular backups of your GPOs, and in fact, no reason to not back up a GPO each time you make a change to it. It just is good change management practice, and it's incredibly easy using GPMC. So let's start off by going to the Group Policy Objects container. And of course, this is where all of the GPOs that are stored within a domain are held or shown here. And if I right-click on this, I have a number of options related to backing up. I can back up all, or I can manage backups. So first time through, let's go ahead and back up all. Now, I can choose a file system location either on the workstation or server that I'm running GPMC on, or of course I could use a network drive to store my group policy object backups. I'll go ahead and browse to the local file system, and I don't have a folder created yet, so I'll just create a new folder, and I'll call it GP Backups, and choose that as my backup location, and I'll say backup folder for cpandle.com domain. And then I'm going to go ahead and select backup. And what's going to happen now is that each GPO within the domain is going to get backed up. And this is going to take a while because I have a number of GPOs in the domain, but essentially what happens during the backup process is that the various requisite parts of a group policy object, the parts in AD, the parts in sysvol, are copied to the file system. In the case of the parts that are held in AD, they're actually copied to the file system as XML files, and the parts that are held in sysvol, whether it be the registry.pol file or any of the other files related to group policy settings, those files are copied as is into the local file system as well. So when this completes, we'll get a chance to see, I'll take a quick look at the contents of the backup directory so that you can see, as an example, how Group Policy Object stores its information during a backup. So we'll let this complete. It's about almost there. I have a fair number of GPOs within my domain, so it takes a little bit of time, but there we go. We had 25 GPOs backed up, and there was some logging information that was held in there as well that I can review later. And if I go ahead and select the folder where I stored these, which is C:GP Backups, what you'll see is a set of folders, GUID-named folders. These represent the GUIDs of the GPO, and if I drill into one of them, you can see here's the contents of sysvol, and this is for this GPO all of the files that you would typically find in sysvol for a group policy object. And then you see these two XML files. Essentially, this backup XML file holds the details related to the AD portion of the group policy object. So you get to see things like the security descriptor on the GPO and a number of other elements or criteria related to this group policy object. So essentially, this is information that is specific to the Group Policy Management Console backup, and it's not really anything that you're going to find useful outside of that, but it does kind of give you a sense of how these backups are stored. Okay, so we've gone ahead and backed up all of our GPOs. If I right-click the Group Policy Objects container again and show Manage Backups, what you see here is basically a window that lets me browse the contents of my backup directory. And you can see that each of these GPOs or each of these backups has the same description, which is backup folder for cpanel.com domains. If I were to have multiple versions of group policy backups in here, then you would see each of the versions of the backup, because each of the versions is stored in a different set of files and folders, and I could essentially view only the latest version of a particular backup by checking this box, or all backups. The View Settings button here will actually let me generate an HTML report that shows the actual settings within this GPO that's been backed up. So it's actually an offline report of what's in the backup file, which can be handy. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. And let me just give you an example of backing up an individual GPO. If I right-click on this administrative software GPO and I say backup, I can say, okay, this is the I want to use this folder, and I can say this is my new backup. And I'll go ahead and back that up, and it runs through that backup process. And then if I go back to Manage Backups, you'll see if I sort by name, you'll see these two backups that have been performed. And then if I maximize this and show only latest version, you'll see that only new backup shows up for administrative software policy. So you have from this screen, you have the opportunity to manage your backups as they're stored in the file system. You can also delete backups, and then you can use the Restore button from here to restore a backup onto the previous group policy. So let's go ahead and make a change to a group policy object. So we'll go ahead and edit this administrative software policy. Now I've made a backup of the GPO prior to making this change, as you saw. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and make any old change. I'll just choose under Computer Configuration, Admin Template System. I'll say enable this restrict potentially unsafe HTML help functions folder, and I'll just say see Windows as the directory. And okay, now I've got this policy enabled, and oops, that's not the change that I wanted to make. I want to really restore the original version of this group policy object. So I choose Restore from Backup, and then use the wizard to take me to the directory that I want. And I have two group policy objects that I can choose from because I did two different backups of this one GPO. And as you can see, there's the description. I can use this button to view the settings to make sure that this is the one I want. So we'll go ahead and do that. And what's going to happen is it's going to bring up a browser window with all of my settings. And of course, if I go into administrative templates, you'll see that the only policy that I have is under administrative templates for computer configuration is this system group policy, this loopback policy. So I'm going to go ahead and say, yes, this is the one I want. I'll choose this one. Next, and then essentially the restore happens. And once the restore is completed, we'll go back into the group policy object to ensure that the setting that we had previously set is no longer there. Now, one thing to keep in mind about the restore process is it's a total overwrite of an existing group policy object. There is no merging of settings that happens. There is no nothing remains of the policy that we're restoring. So if you use this capability, you need to make sure that there's nothing in that group policy object that you want to save. And in fact, there is really no merge capability available. If you wanted to merge two group policy object settings together, there's no capability available within GPMC to do that. So we're going to go ahead and back into System. And as you can see, this restrict potentially unsafe HTML help functions is set back to not configured. One other thing I want to mention before I move on is around the scripts that are available within GPMC and how you can use them with respect to backup and restore. If I open up a command shell and I go to the Program Files GPMC Scripts folder, if I do a dir, you'll see a number of scripts related to group policy management that are related to GPMC. And in fact, the very first script is backup all GPOs. So if I type C script backup all GPOs, you'll see that I have the option of performing a script-based backup of all of my GPOs to the folder that I choose using a comment. And one obvious value to this is that you could take this script and run it with the task scheduler to run on a periodic basis, whether it be weekly or nightly, to back up all of your existing GPOs. There's also a script in here that lets you back up individual GPOs, and that's the backup GPO. And you can provide the name of the GPO you want to back up, the location, and again a comment, and it will back up that GPO. And again, you could run this in Task Scheduler. Now, there's also the ability to restore a backup from restore a GPO from a backup. Obviously, there's this particular script, restore all GPOs, can be very dangerous, and it's not probably one you're going to want to run very often, but it is available to restore all GPOs. The other option is to restore a single GPO, which is probably more likely. And again, you choose the backup location where the backups are held, the backup ID, which is that GUID that we saw, or the GPO name. It's best to use the backup ID in case there are multiple backups for a particular GPO. And then again, the DNS name of the domain that you want to back up to, and optionally you can use the DC. It will default to restoring to the PDC emulator when you're doing a restore. So that's the script-based mechanisms for managing backup and restore. So let's. The next thing I want to do is I want to take a look at the copy and paste function within Group Policy Management Console. So Group Policy Management Console has the ability to do copy and paste, so that if you have a GPO that contains a set of settings that you like, you can go ahead and copy that GPO and store it into a new group policy object. So what we're going to do now is we're going to right-click on this GP processing policy. We're going to go ahead and copy that, and then we're going to basically paste it into a new GPO. If I go up to the group policy objects container and enter paste, you'll see it's basically gives you the option of using of creating a set of permissions on the GPO based on your needs. So the default is to use default permissions for new GPOs. What this means is that whenever you create a new GPO in a particular domain, by default it gets a set of security descriptors or ACEs that are standard for that domain. Typically those are things like group policy creator owner, domain admins, enterprise admins. Now, of course, over time, using Group Policy Management Console, you can modify the security on a GPO. You can add different security filters. You can add delegation so that other people can edit that GPO. Now, this screen is asking me whether or not I want to create or paste my new GPO into the domain using default permissions, in other words, the permissions that get inherited from the domain, or by preserving the existing permissions on the GPO that I'm copying from. So if that GPO had additional permissions that had been set by an administrator, I can preserve those during the paste operation. So I'll go ahead and choose default, and now you can see that essentially what happens is I'm making a copy of this GPO, and now I have here a copy of GP processing policy. It's got a new GUID, but it's got the name of copy of and the name of the original, and I can go ahead and rename that, and I can call it GP processing 2 or something like that, and I now have a group policy object with the exact same settings that the original GP processing policy came with. So these two policies have the identical settings. And so one thing to know about the copy and paste operation is it only works within a single forest. Of course, you can manage multiple forests from GPMC, but you can't perform certain operations within forests. Now, another thing to know is it works best within a single domain. If you're trying to paste across domains, you may have issues with security principles not being valid or relevant across those domains, and in that case you may need to build what's called a migration table, and I'll talk about that in a second. So the next thing I want to do actually is look at how we can do cross-forest copies. In that case, what you're performing is actually an import function rather than a copy and paste. And an import function relies on basically making a backup or using the backup that we created earlier, and using that as the source for the GPO that you're going to create in the target environment. So let's go down. I have a second forest set up here called test.tld. This is actually a Windows 2000 forest. I'm going to go ahead and create or use my test policy here, and I'm going to create a backup of it. And of course the backup gets created in the same part of the file system that my Windows Server 2003 cpandle.com forest used. So I'm going to go ahead and say test backup for test.tld domain. Go ahead and select backup, and that succeeded. Now what I want to do is I want to go back up to cpandle, and I want to basically import this new or the backed up group policy that I took from my Win2K domain. I want to import that into my Server 2003 domain. Now again, these are in separate forests. A good example of where you might use this is if you have a test forest where you want to test group policy changes, and then you want to bring that group policy object into the new forest or the production forest. So I'm going to go ahead and click on group policy objects, and I'm going to go ahead and create a new group policy object, and this is going to be my import target. I'll just call it that for convenience. And the import target GPO, I'm going to right click on and say import settings. Now I'm going to walk through a wizard that's going to perform the import for me. I have the option here of backing up this GPO prior to importing settings into it, because again, like the restore function, when I do an import, it wipes out all of the settings that exist in the GPO. So essentially what I'm doing here is basically I've created a shell of a GPO, and I'm going to stuff all of the settings from my backup into that shell. Okay, now I'm going to point to the backups folder where I have my backup stored, and I'm going to select the test policy that I just backed up, and here it is, test policy for test.tld, and I'm going to go ahead and the GPO is going to be scanned for security principles or UNC paths, and in this case it didn't find any, so I'm going to go ahead and do a next, and the GPO is imported. So I've basically just imported a GPO from a foreign forest into my cpandle.com domain. Now what I want to do is show you what happens when there are security principles that need to be managed, that there's security filtering, for example, that might need to be managed, that there's different UNC paths. UNC paths would be related to, for example, software deployment. If I have a software installation policy that maps to a UNC path in a domain, in one domain or one forest, that may not be relevant in the destination forest. So I need to be able to map to a new UNC path. Similarly, if I have global groups in a particular forest that are specific to that that forest, that particular domain, that aren't relevant in the destination forest, I'm going to need to map those global groups. So what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and take my software installation policy, and I'm going to do a little bit of futzing around with it to try to show you what this looks like. I'm going to go ahead and generate a report, and you'll see that I have XP that's actually published or assigned in this package, and it's got a path here, 2K test DC is the path to the package. So I've got a path to a package here, and I'm going to go ahead and try to back up this GPO. I'll go ahead and back it up, and I'll say test.tld backup of software installation, and it's going to go ahead and back it up, and the backup succeeded. And now I'm going to go ahead and go back up to my group policy objects in my cpanel.com domain, go back to my import target, and try importing again. And now I'm going to choose that software installation backup that I chose, that I backed up just now. And now you see the backup contains references to security principles and or UNC paths. To specify how the wizard should transfer these references, click Next. Okay, now I have the option of basically choosing a number of options for migrating those principles and the UNC paths. I can either copy them identically, in other words, leave them intact, or I can use what's called a migration table to map them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose to use a migration table. And now I have an option that says use migration table exclusively if any security principles or UNC paths in the GPO backup are not found in the migration table, do not perform the operation. So that's telling it basically I need to map every one of my security principles or don't do the operation. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new mapping table, and what happens is a little mapping table editor gets brought up. Now, this editor is a separate utility called MTE Edit that is available as part of the GPMC. I'll go ahead and maximize it. I have a number of options for populating this table. One is I can populate it from the live GPO. The other is I can populate it from a backup. I'm going to go ahead and populate from a backup because that's the one I'm working with. I'm going to go to my software installation. This is the backup of the software installation policy that I did in test.tld, and I'm going to go ahead and choose that one. And I'll go ahead and maximize this so I can get to my button. So I've got that one chosen. Now there's a couple options down here. I can do the show only latest version. I can also do during scan include security principles from the DACL on the GPO. By default, what the migration table editor looks at is any security principles or UNC paths, or specifically security principles, that are stored within policy settings. For example, if I have a user rights assignment policy within a GPO that says allow logon from the network to the desktop administrators group, that security principle is within the group policy, and that needs to be translated when I take a policy from one domain or forest to another. But there are also security descriptors on the actual GPO. So of course, if I've delegated administration to that GPO to my GPO administrators group, I might want to include those security principles in the mapping so that they can get modified as they go over. So I'll go ahead and click this and say OK. And it maps, it looks into the GPO, and it finds these groups that basically exist on the source that aren't or that may or may not be relevant on the target. Domain admins and test.tld, enterprise admins at test.tld, and this path to this software distribution package that I created. What I'm going to do now is go into the destination, and I'm going to right-click and choose Set Destination. And for one of these, I'm going to say Map by Relative Name. And what that means is it's going to take the domain admins portion of that source, and it's going to remap it to cpanel.com. So this will become domain admins at cpanel.com when I perform the import using this migration table. And I'm going to do the same thing for the enterprise admins group. Now what I want to do, let me just go back here for a second. The other option here is same as source. Now same as source means that I leave the test.tld enterprise admins group intact. That may or may not work depending on the trust relationships between the domains. The other option, of course, is that I could type in a different group altogether. I could type in GPO admins here. sorry, I could just GPO admins. Sorry, I actually have a number of options. I can either browse or I can type GPO admins. In most cases, the best option is to browse, and I could choose a group. Let's look for a GP group, and there's my GPO admins group. And it tells me that the object source doesn't match the target. Do I want to continue? In this case, I'll just say no, and I'll go ahead back to my map by relative name. Now on this one, I want to go ahead and enter a different path. In this case, I have a path to Corp Server 01 Packages Office XP. And now I'm going to save my migration table. I'll go ahead and save it in my documents, and I'll call it test to cPandle. Now I have a migration table. Now I'll go ahead and let that save. And now I'm going to go back to my Group Policy Management Console wizard. Actually, I guess I'll close the migration table editor first, and it brings me back into focus. And actually now you see that it automatically created or selected that test to cPandle migration table, and with a mig table extension. I'm going to go ahead and say next, and I'm all set to do the import. And what happens during the import is that migration table is used to map security principles and UNC paths from the source to the target. So when I import that target GPO into the cPandle.com destination forest, it will have the correct path under the package, and it will have basically the correct information for security principles. Now, in this case, unfortunately, I didn't actually have the path, this package in this path, and so it gave me an error saying, sorry, I can't do this. So it actually went out and tried to create the pieces of the software installation policy that it needed within the sysvol portion of the GPO, and because it didn't find the package, it failed. So normally what would happen is that would succeed. I'd have those settings there, and the import would have succeeded in mapping the security principles. Okay, one other thing I want to mention is that if I go back up to the Group Policy Objects container and right-click on it, I can actually open the migration table editor outside of the import process and create my own migration tables for any variety of migration scenarios that I might have. So that's the majority of what I wanted to cover. The last thing I want to just talk about briefly is the reporting capabilities in GPMC. If I go into this group policy object as an example, there's a number of settings in it. If I go ahead, I'm on the settings tab here. If I go ahead and right click on the settings tab, you'll see that I have the option to save the report. I can save it either as an HTML file, in which case it will appear just as it appears in this window here, or I can save it as an XML file, in which case it'll create a raw XML file that I could basically go out and use for any number of things. Let's go ahead and take a look at that XML file that just got created. So here it is. And as you can see, it's created a lot of information about this GPO in XML format, including the descriptors, security descriptors on it, a number of other information related to the GPO, and then here we start getting into some of the settings, in this case the administrative template settings for the group policy object. So you have a number of options here for reporting within the group policy management console, HTML or XML, or of course you can print this directly to a printer. Another thing that I'll mention is that there are scripts that allow you to do some of this reporting as well. So you can actually get reports for GPO will basically generate either an HTML or a XML file for a particular GPO. So if I type cscript get reports for GPO, I enter in the name of the GPO, the file system location to save it, and it will go ahead and actually save both HTML and XML for that particular GPO. So that concludes this session. In summary, I covered backing up and restoring of a GPO, copying and pasting, and then performing imports. One thing I will say about the import function is that it's the most useful function for doing migrations from test to production environments where there are no trust relationships in place. So because it's based on a backup that sits in a file system somewhere, all you need is permissions to the backup files from your destination forest, and you're successfully able to import those in either with or without a migration table. And that concludes this session.